We're over live at the Congressional Defense and Foreign Policy Forum. Their discussion getting underway about 10 minutes ago, live here on C-SPAN.
The document reveals a president committed to pursuing a peace-through-strength military and leaning forward in critical parts of the world where America's vital interests are under assault. Peace through strength. This was the approach to national security by President Reagan. It also is the approach to national security that my organization, the Center for Security Policy, has been promoting since the Reagan administration. And I know Heritage and the Center for Security Policy are just delighted that President Trump has moved towards this approach to national security that helped us defeat the Soviet Union, and I think will help us defeat enemies that face us today. The economy is a big part of this. The president wants free and fair trade deals. He wants trade deals where the other nation doesn't cheat. We don't look the other way while the nation cheats. And obviously here I'm talking about China, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. And I mean, it goes without saying that the president takes a dim view of the foreign policy establishment. Elitists in Europe and in the U.S. who think they run the world to promote their own liberal values and globalism. They've promoted military operations to do nation building, cede U.S. sovereignty to international organizations hostile to the U.S. and Israel, and promote leftist ideologies, socialism, and high taxes. Now, this is why the United States has pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council and UNESCO over the last couple of years, because of the hostility of these organizations towards the State of Israel. This hostility is unacceptable to the United States, and it is interesting. This is the second time we withdrew from UNESCO. I think the Obama administration rejoined it, and I think it was, again, a principled thing to do. Now, what we're talking about here is in stark contrast to President Obama, who might be the ultimate foreign policy establishment president, who ran a foreign policy of apology tours in the Middle East, leading from behind in the Middle East, strategic patience on North Korea, and red lines and ultimatums that were repeatedly set for parties in the Middle East and Russia that were just made and ignored. You see, when the U.S. does this, we lose credibility. We're emboldening and encouraging rogue states to engage in more belligerent and destabilizing behavior. The approach by President Trump leaves our enemies worried, leaves them guessing, and I think has led to some significant advances in promoting international security. If we have a credible and decisive U.S. president, the world is more secure. And I think that's something that President Trump is trying to prove every day. The president does not like indefinite troop deployments. And we know this when we look at the situation in Syria, as he has tried to balance the interests of the United States and our allies and his belief that U.S. troops should not be in situations there indefinitely. And if there are troops there, the U.S. should not share all the burden. I think the president speaks for the vast majority of the American people when he says this. And his desire that other nations have to carry the weight obviously has been factored into his policy towards NATO. NATO states are supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on the military, and I think only 5 of them are doing so. And it's not that the U.S. can't afford to do this. They made a commitment to do this. And when we ignore this commitment, we're undermining our credibility. We want them to live up to their commitment. They want us to live up to our commitment. So this has been a big issue for the president, and he's making progress in getting NATO states to start to meet their commitment. I think they have till 2025 to meet that commitment, and it's been slow going, but there's been some progress on that. This president has carried out a number of fairly significant foreign policy initiatives, some of which the foreign policy establishment opposes, but I think they have been very successful, and they have been moves of great principle. The two that come to mind immediately was the president's decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and to recognize Israeli sovereignty of the Golan Heights. Now, numerous presidents said they were going to move, numerous presidential candidates said they would move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, but they never did so because the foreign policy establishment and the State Department opposed this, because it would be too disruptive with Arab states. It would make it harder to get a peace treaty with the Palestinians. The problem is the time's up. The time is up with the Palestinians to make a peace treaty if they're going to say, well, we're not going to deal with you if you move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. This should have been done a long time ago, and I think the president just decided it's time. The same for the Golan Heights, which Israel annexed in 1981. This is part of Israel. If we had given, or if the Golan Heights had been given back to Syria, and parts of it were supposed to be given back under peace plans discussed over the last 20 years, think of the threat Israel would face today. This high ground would be used by Iran and Hezbollah to rain down rockets and missiles on the state of Israel. This territory is obviously never going back to Syria. And is there really a Syria today? The Syria today is a shadow of what it was a few years ago. This is something that is in Israel's interests. This is not going to interfere with the peace plan, assuming we can move forward with the peace plan. It was a matter of principle for the President to do this, and I congratulate him for doing that. I've worked closely with Ambassador Bolton on the nuclear deal with Iran. I believe the nuclear deal with Iran is a fraud, that Iran has been cheating on it from the day that it was announced, that there's been significant information lately that the Israelis have produced an archive of Iranian documents, that Iran has been cheating on this agreement and has continued to engage in nuclear weapons-related activities since it was announced. This agreement also allows Iran to continue to advance its nuclear program by letting it enrich uranium with 5,000 centrifuges while the deal is in place, to develop advanced centrifuges. Iran was supposed to be given a heavy water reactor. It disabled one it was building, but one would be built for it. Now, although this reactor would produce less plutonium, it would produce a quarter of a weapon's worth of plutonium a year. Iran should not have any plutonium. Iran has violated its nuclear treaty obligations repeatedly, and we know this from revelations from the MEK during the George W. Bush administration. It has pursued every possible avenue in secret to develop nuclear fuel. Now, we know Iran's allowed to develop nuclear fuel, but when it does it in secret, that's not a peaceful purpose. And these were not declared with the IAEA. It broke its treaty obligations. And I think the U.S. position should be Iran should not have nuclear technology. We should cut it off with strong sanctions. So about a year ago, the President withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal with Iran that was announced in 2015. Now, this is a deal that was negotiated so it would not be a treaty. That way the Senate didn't get a chance to vote on it. See, treaties need a two-thirds vote to ratify them. There was a vote in the Senate, but opponents had to get two-thirds. There was this bizarre mechanism that I hope no staffers in this room have to deal with, where the House and Senate could reject the treaty if there was two-thirds in opposition. Andy McCarthy at National Review said this threw the Constitution on its head. It's not the way our government is supposed to operate. But this was negotiated deliberately to get around the representatives of the American people. A majority of Congress voted against this deal. A large majority of the American people were against this deal. And I think pulling out of it was the right decision. But it was hard, because not only were there people on the left who wanted to stay in this deal, but there were mistaken people on the right who thought it could be fixed. That is a myth. This deal was not fixable. It was so fatally flawed. Not only does it allow the problems that I just announced, it did not include missiles. It did not include Iran's sponsorship of terrorism. It's meddling in the Middle East. It was a disaster. It was absolutely unfixable. Now, you know that some of the President's advisors fought with him and tried to keep him in the deal. When the President let them go and brought in Ambassador Bolton, he made the right call and got out of this disastrous deal. So I congratulate the President for, again, an important act of leadership. The same thing was true of the Paris Climate Accord. This is an agreement that would cost the U.S. $3.5 trillion by 2035. Thousands of U.S. jobs would be lost. The U.S. electricity bills would go up 15 to 30%, and it would do almost nothing to affect the climate. Some experts think it would have no effect at all, but it would be a big benefit to the economies of India, China, and Europe. This agreement was also negotiated so it would not be ratified by the Senate. The Obama administration signed it. The Senate didn't have a chance to ratify it, even though there were other governments that did ratify it, other legislatures. I might add, the Iran deal was ratified by the Iranian parliament, but it was not ratified by our Senate. I mean, this was an obvious effort to get around the U.S. Constitution by the last administration. It was an effort by the elites who think they know better than the American people. And I mean, these factors had a role in the election of Mr. Trump. The American people were tired of the foreign policy establishment people who think they know better than us going around the U.S. Congress, going around the Constitution to impose agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear agreement on the American people. There's an effort right now to get there's an effort right now to address NAFTA and TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, two agreements which the President backed out of. The USMCA is an alternative to NAFTA, which we're hoping that Congress will sign on to too. In the President's view, this is an agreement that left American workers behind and was just not too good a deal for other nations. It did not represent the interests of the American people. Now, turning to other issues, the President promised to destroy ISIS. Now, destroying a terrorist movement completely is difficult, and I think radical Islam is a movement that is not simply linked to a terrorist group with a presence on the ground. But ISIS has lost its presence on the ground, and that's because the President put out a policy where the White House was no longer micromanaging U.S. forces fighting in Syria, and we were allowed to do the airstrikes and operations on the ground that were necessary to defeat ISIS. ISIS is still around, but ISIS's presence in holding territory, that has ended, and that is because of the policy of Mr. Trump. The President recognizes the threat from radical Islam, and this is reflected in last year's national counterterrorism strategy that for the first time cites radical Islam as a driver of terrorism. This was a big change from the Obama years where you weren't allowed to use the term radical Islam and a whole sort of other words that were on a blacklist of things that we could not say. We can't defeat an enemy that we won't name, that we won't admit that exists. The President has advised us to understand that this exists, and it's something that he's been focusing on. There's a lot of talk about trade deals with China. This has also been a big focus of the President's America First strategy to get free and fair deals, to stop the Chinese engaging in predatory trade, and to stop stealing intellectual property. There's been significant movement in these talks, positive movement. We're not to a deal yet. But as our economy is surging and China's economy is in trouble, and with a credible U.S. president who, as we know, will walk away if other parties are not negotiating in good faith, I think it has led to a situation where it's looking likely we're going to get a good deal, but still we have to get there. Border enforcement is also another important part of America First. Strict border enforcement and tougher rules on immigration. This is something, as you know, the President talks about frequently. He believes this is an important issue of Homeland Security to protect our economy and our security. And it's what the American people want. When the American people see thousands of people trying to illegally emigrate to the United States across our southern border, I got to tell you, I think they're with the President on this, that this is not something that we should be permitting. And it's a shame that just a few short years ago, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Dianne Feinstein, they all agreed that we have to stop illegal immigration across our southern border. This is something the President's taken a tough stand on. It's unpopular and politically incorrect, but that's the way this President is, and that's what America First does. It doesn't really worry about the conventional view of issues like this. We really need to talk about Russia, especially this week that the Mueller report came out and threw out this idea that there was some collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. That I'm not going to talk about today. The President thinks we should have a working relationship with Russia. This is not very different than the Obama administration. Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal on earth, has a large military. We have to be able to talk to the Russians, and that's been the President's support from the beginning. But what the media is not telling you is that the President has been much tougher on Russia than the Obama administration. Very tough measures have been imposed to sanction individuals who meddled in our 2016 election. And on a related point, and I was involved in this at the NSC, some very good and tough measures have been engaged and passed to protect the integrity of future elections. There's no mention of that at all on TV. I've been in the interagency meetings. This is a serious matter to Ambassador Bolton. There's comprehensive measures to protect our election. So next time you watch MSNBC and CNN and they whine on and on that this administration has done nothing to protect our elections, it's not true. It isn't true. And I think these pundits, they know it isn't true. But I've seen these policies and they're comprehensive. It's something that Bolton takes very, very seriously. Over 100 Russians and entities have been sanctioned for meddling in Ukraine. And unlike the Obama administration, which sent non-lethal military equipment into Ukraine, this administration sent lethal military aid to Ukraine. There's been strong opposition by this administration to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in Europe, which would yield hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for the Russians, but also would link Europe too closely to Russian gas. And for this reason, we've fought pretty hard about that, and the President's made progress in trying to stop this from moving forward. And I think most importantly, we closed multiple Russian consulates in the U.S. and kicked out a number of Russian diplomats who we know to be intelligence officers after the horrendous incidents in the U.K. of Russian intelligence trying to assassinate former Russian intelligence agents with chemical weapons agents in the United Kingdom. We work with our allies on that. It was the right thing to do, and I think we'll see more actions like that in the future. There actually are many, many examples of this administration being tough on Russia, and you don't hear any of them in the press. And I think that they're very significant, and it's something that this president just isn't getting credit for. I've done a lot of work on North Korea, and North Korea certainly is something that needs to be discussed here. The president has ended or at least had North Korea suspend its missile launches. The North Koreans tested at least 80 missiles during the Clinton years, tested 4 nuclear weapons. There was a test of what may have been a hydrogen bomb tested in September 2017. All this ended in late 2017, and it ended for a number of reasons. First of all, the president managed to get other nations to start enforcing UN sanctions against North Korea. There was massive cheating, especially by China, against these sanctions. The president twisted some arms, called people out. I'll tell you, I don't think certain nations like being the focus of a presidential tweet, that they're cheating on sanctions, and the president's not shy about calling people out. I think that this has had an effect. But in addition, the president was pretty clear in his rhetoric against North Korea, including threatening at the UN General Assembly to totally destroy North Korea if it threatened their allies. And you remember how angry all the pundits were, and the New York Times was when he said that the president threatened military action in an organization of peace, but the president calls it like it is. And I think that that threat stunned the North Koreans and really put them off balance and led them to decide in early 2018 that it was time to talk. Now, these talks have not gotten where we want them to get. The North Koreans have agreed to things in principle. There recently were talks in Vietnam. The president walked out on them because Kim Jong-un was asking for more than we were prepared to offer. But the tensions between the two nations are significantly better. There has been dialogue, a lot more dialogue behind the scenes than is generally known. I think we're close to getting an agreement where there will be inspections of North Korea's nuclear test site and a missile assembly facility. I know that the South Korean president is traveling to Washington soon to see what he can do to get the negotiations moving. We have a lot of work to do here, and I think that we're going to need Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Bolton to keep grinding away to get an agreement with the North. But the president, as Bolton likes to say, opened the door to a peaceful solution with the United States. Kim has not yet chosen to walk through that door. That doesn't mean he's not going to walk through it, but this is hard for the North Koreans, and I'm hopeful that the president's personal diplomacy with Kim and the diplomatic opportunities we've seen over the last year will eventually lead to an agreement. And the final international issue I want to talk about is Venezuela. The U.S. recognized Juan Guaido as interim president of Venezuela early this year after he was recognized as the acting president of Venezuela. This was a bold move because getting Maduro to leave power is going to be difficult. Working with our allies, and we've organized an international coalition backing Guaido, the next step is to get the states who are supporting the Maduro regime, Russia, China, and Cuba, to stop doing so. And I think that the use of force is available. I don't know how or when it would be used, but we are upping the pressure on Maduro. The whole region is against Maduro. Europe, which did not want to back the president's approach, gave Maduro an opportunity for talks, which we weren't happy about. But fortunately, Maduro turned that down too. So we now have Europe behind this initiative that was started by the United States. It's a gamble, but I think it is the best approach to try to deal with the situation the terrible humanitarian situation that the Venezuelan people are suffering under right now. So in terms of looking forward, we have a strong and decisive American president, and I think that has made the world safer. We know that a strong and decisive president keeps our enemies off balance and guessing. That keeps the world safer too. There's a reason why Iran has stopped harassing American shipping in the Persian Gulf, and their Houthi rebel proxies have stopped firing missiles at ships in the Red Sea, because they don't know what President Trump would do if that happened. That's leadership. That's how we keep the world safer. A strong and decisive United States, a strong and decisive president is good for U.S. national security, is good for global security. The president has tried to rebuild and strengthen key alliances, especially with Israel. I think that I'm most proud of what the president has tried to do to work with Israel. He's made it clear to the Israeli government that if there is a nuclear deal with Iran, a new deal, we're going to talk to the Israelis. We're not going to throw it at them and say, this is what we agreed to. After all, Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, they're more affected by the threat from Iran than we are. But this terrible nuclear deal, they had no say in. They didn't know what we were agreeing to before the agreement was announced. The Clinton administration negotiated something called the Agreed Framework on North Korea's nuclear program. It was a terrible agreement, but at least the South Korean and Japanese governments were at the table. We consulted with them before we made a deal. We didn't consult with the Israelis or Saudis or Gulf states at all before we agreed to this monstrosity with Iran. And I think the states in the region, they appreciate that, and they know that the president wants to work with them. So I think the president has a very good relationship with our Middle East friends and allies, with Canada, and we do have a good relationship with Europe, although they would prefer we get back into the Iran deal. It's interesting, that the European leaders said there's no point in the Trump administration pulling out of the Iran deal because we're going to stay in it, the sanctions are going to stay in place. But the thing is that for European multinationals, if they have to choose between doing business with the United States and Iran, whose economy is broken, they tend not to pay their debts, and if your executives go over there, they may be arrested. It's not a hard call, and companies are leaving Iran, European companies are leaving Iran by the drove because they want to do business in the United States, and they're worried about sanctions that will be imposed upon them if they keep dealing with Iran. Now, there's a workaround European states have tried to come up with to allow European companies to do business with Iran despite our sanctions. This was almost a year late, and frankly, it's not going to work. So I know that's been talked about in the Western press recently. Frankly, that's not going to get anywhere. So the Trump doctrine is America first. It is principled realism. It is a benign nationalism that looks out for the interests of the American people, the American worker, American security, American prosperity. And I think it's a new strategy that's working. And I think it has created a lot of potential and hope for our national security in the future. So I've been proud to be part of it. I think that we're going to, and also it's been a work in progress. And we've been seeing such in the national security strategy. We know what the president announced during the campaign. And we've seen, as the administration progressed and as experts worked on it, how this strategy has been developed into a comprehensive approach to deal with national security problems. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today. I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Given your experience, CIA, State Department, what would a military intervention look like in Venezuela?
Well, I don't think that President Trump has any interest in invading Venezuela. I think that's been pretty clear. But Ambassador Bolton has made it clear that if American citizens are put at risk, that is a different matter. And there's at least 1,000 American citizens in Venezuela. But in terms of a military presence to forcibly remove the Guaido regime, that is not something, as far as I know, that the president is going to do. I imagine if there are scenarios where we're going to invade, I'm not aware of them, and if I did know, I don't think I would. I'd tell you. Yes, sir.
You emphasize the policy based on pressuring our adversary based on strength. South Korea's goal toward North Korea has long been, for decades, it has been free, based on freedom for North Korean people, and the unification based on freedom and democracy. And they failed, but they were pursuing that. Actually, North Korea was a part of, the whole Republic of Korea based on South Korea's constitution. Anyway, I have noticed that after all these years of strategic patience and so on, Trump came up, and what he did, in my view, what he did was that gave up the liberation of North Korea, gave up freedom for North Korea, and then started respecting North Korean dictator, and then he started negotiating instead of pressuring, and then actually North Korea's livelihood, existence is depending on the U.S. And for the first time in history, President Trump promised not to touch. That was a part of the negotiation. Let the what do you call regime guarantee, that kind of thing. So I'm really disappointed about what he has been doing. He went to Singapore under the persuasion of South Korean president, leftist president, and he went to Hanoi, again pressured by South Korean president, leftist president. Fortunately, lucky part is that he kicked out of the Hanoi, but now looks like he's going back with kind of friendship with the North Korean dictator. Again, I'm sure South Korea's Moon Jae-in will keep persuading. He's coming here again the next few days to persuade Trump again to get together with Kim Jong-un and so on. So could you try to convince me that Trump is not propping up a North Korean dictator?
Well, the president hasn't given anything to North Korea. They've been given a bilateral meeting with the president, but there's not going to be a deal until the North Korea agrees to negotiate in earnest. It's been a concern of this administration that President Moon wants to move too fast to give concessions to the North before the North gives anything. And I think the North thought in Vietnam that they could convince us to lift sanctions for very little in return from the U.S. We've seen this over and over again with North Korea, that the North Koreans get us involved in negotiations. We give them concessions, and they either give us nothing or whatever they agree to, they backtrack on later. Ambassador Bolton and Secretary Pompeo, they are aware of that. And the North Korea has an opportunity to do the right thing and negotiate with us in earnest. But if they don't, we're going to resume the pressure we had put on the state before. And look, I understand that it is difficult to watch U.S. officials interacting with such a ruthless dictator. I find it difficult to watch too. But I also see a state that's developing a hydrogen bomb and is developing missiles that could possibly hit the east coast of the United States. And this is a significant threat. Now, if we're not going to bomb them or attack them, and the U.S. isn't going to do that, the solution is we have to find a diplomatic solution, but it has to be a diplomatic solution on our terms. So I know this is hard to watch, and I wish there was another way to do it, but realistically, I think this is a way of approaching it. The president has done some interesting things with Kim that haven't really been noticed. The first meeting with Kim was in Singapore. That got Kim out of the bubble he lives in Pyongyang, got him away from his advisors. It gave him an opportunity to see the prosperity of Singapore. It gave us an opportunity to talk to him and explain to him what North Korea could become if it agreed to a peace deal. It was an approach, it was a typical Trumpian approach. Throughout the diplomatic rule book, no one would have thought that. He was shown a movie that depicted how North Korea could thrive if it normalized relations with the United States. I don't know that this is going to work. I think we're in a better position now than we were, but I share your concern that we could make a deal without North Korea actually coming across with the concessions that they're supposed to. I know there's people in the State Department, they're pushing for bad deals. And I know Bolton and Pompeo are trying to keep them under control. So that's the best I can offer you. But I appreciate your question, sir. Yes, sir.
One of the things that's just been stunning about the last 2.5 years or so is the reaction of the, what for want of a better term you might call the foreign policy establishment to the president's proposals. And to the point where suggesting that NATO should be reformed for the 21st century was seen as proof that the president was a Russian spy and needed to be defeated or removed from office by any means necessary. I worry that after the president leaves office, that we'll sort of snap back into the old ways of thinking simply because so many people who are in these dominant positions in think tanks and academia and in the government, State Department, are of this mindset, which my personal opinion, I consider extremist and ignorant, but nevertheless, they're in there. And do you have anything you can offer as hope that might not be the case, that we might be getting some reforms and some smarter people in key positions?
I think we're slowly getting reforms. I think what you said is right about NATO. We're reforming it. And it's slow going because there's resistance from foreign policy professionals. And look, they're good people. They just have a different view. They were brought up with a different approach to these issues. I've done some work with UN organizations. They're very cushy jobs. And frankly, they like to go out to lunch and have cocktails. And some of them, I don't know what they do. But the president's aware of that. We need to staff the government, frankly. There's a lot of key jobs vacant in this government at the State Department. And the president has this ambitious agenda. He can't carry it out if he doesn't fill all the jobs. And I was just talking with some of the folks at this table beforehand. They're all aware of this. And I understand there will be some changes made to try to remove the obstacles to filling them. But look, time is running out. And I hope they'll be filled quickly to do these things. Yes?
About the North Korean strategy when it comes to human rights as well as denuclearization. Like, what will a final deal include in terms of like pressuring the regime on their human rights abuses?
I think that's a real question, a good question. I don't know how that's going to be addressed. I think our priority right now was to address the missile and nuclear threat. I know this has been discussed in the talks. I would like to see major achievements made in this, and not simply the oppression of the North Koreans, but the abduction of Japanese citizens by the North Korean government, which I think is a real concern to Japan. And I know the president has raised this repeatedly, including with Prime Minister Abe. I think it has to be part of the talks, but it's a difficult issue because we're so concerned about the nuclear threat. But I hope it isn't left on the side. Yes, sir.
Just on the point on filling the positions, my understanding is that the debate rule in the Senate is being changed from 30 hours per nominee to 2 hours.
That's great.
So I don't know if that's been, I don't know if that was as of yesterday that I saw that in a message to Cuccinelli.
That's good news.
So I just thought I'd mention that.
No, that's good news. I mean, it's pretty clear that too many good nominees are being blocked for no apparent reason, and hopefully that'll fix it.
Why don't you take one more question? Actually, why don't you take two more questions? Are you good on time?
Sure,
We'll
sure.
do two more questions.
Hello.
Do you have any suggestions for how to resolve this North Korean nuclear problems after post-Hanoi? For example, to increase South Korean involvement, or what is your assessment of the situation, and how would you go about it from now on, moving forward?
Well, first of all, I would like to see.
In your opinion?
Well, the first question, I'd like to see all players to stick together. I want to see China and South Korea and Japan not move forward with any type of agreements or lessening trade sanctions on North Korea until there's a deal, because they're just going to remove or reduce the leverage we have to get a good deal. I think Kim saw how determined the president is, that he's not going to agree to a partial deal. He's not going to drop sanctions for very little in return from the North. He's looking for a comprehensive deal. I think that was a good signal being sent in Vietnam. It's very hard for diplomats to walk away. And you know, there was actually preparations for some type of celebration in Vietnam for a big agreement. And in my experience, and look, I love the State Department, but they love these signing ceremonies. They love saying, oh, we got an agreement. There's a big picture taken of everybody who negotiated it. State people, they love that. And to walk away and to not do that, that's hard. And people are disappointed. All the preparations have to be canceled. But, I mean, I'm convinced the president wants a good deal. I know Bolton and Pompeo want a good deal. And I think we send a message to the North. That's what we're working on now. Now, concerning reports that North Korea is cheating, it seems every month there's a think tank in Washington that says we have satellite imagery that the North Koreans are building missiles or they're preparing to test a nuclear weapon. It's hard to know what the North Koreans are doing. I got to tell you, these think tanks often don't know what they're talking about. It's very difficult to interpret satellite data. The North Koreans are always moving equipment around at nuclear sites because they know we're watching. Sometimes they just want to freak us out, and they're not doing anything. The CIA and our imagery agencies, they know what's going on. But when CSIS and other organizations put out another urgent report, or we have satellite imagery, we caught the North Koreans cheating, they don't know anything the government doesn't already know, and I can tell you the government knows a lot more than they know. So as I said, it's complicated. And I don't doubt that North Korea is continuing nuclear missile activities, but we need to get a declaration from them of what they're doing and a firm commitment that they will stop what they're doing right now. We're not to that point yet. So I think the story is more complicated than some of the press reports that you may have heard.
Okay, one more question.
Thank you. KT Wang with NTD TV. In your talk, you touched upon the U.S.-China relations and the trade talks, and you also said that President, his doctrine is to defend American values. So in this U.S.-China relations, I'm just wondering, how do you see this like a human rights issue, rule of law? Where is the position of this in this overall relations?
I think human rights in China are a very serious issue. There have been reports in the Washington Post lately about the Uyghur Muslims and the unbelievable oppression of them. We know what's going on in Tibet. We know how many journalists have been arrested. We know the terrible oppression in China. And it is an issue that we raise with the Chinese through diplomatic channels. The president is trying to work out a relationship so both nations can get along, and to not just in the economic sphere, but in the security sphere. He's tried to build and work on his relationship with President Xi. But look, there are real human rights issues here, very serious ones that you don't hear about in the press very often. And I think that our officials are raising them at the right levels, but it's complicated because on one hand, we want to get a trade deal so the Chinese will stop damaging the U.S. economy. On the other hand, we know what's going on in parts of China where people are subject to some pretty brutal oppression. So I hope we have our U.S. officials who work on this, that they'll speak up on this more often. I know the Center for Security Policy tries to. And before I go, the Center for Security Policy is a nonprofit national security organization. We have a website, securefreedom.org. I hope you'll check it out. Lately, we have been focusing on the U.S.-Israel relationship and what we think is a sharp rise in anti-Semitism on the left, and we're trying to take a stand on that. I don't want to get into that today, but we're so happy to work with Suzanne and the Defense Forum Foundation, and I hope you check out our website, securefreedom.org.